lead to another 9/11 and a resultant weakened presidency, according to some. Yet because of compromises made decades ago that led to the isolation of Du Bois and Robeson on the premise that we would receive civil rights concessions in return, some of Mr. Obama's most passionate supporters are missing in action on the important front that is foreign affairs. They don't have his back. What this means is that President Obama's supporters have not, some of his supporters have not weighed in on some of the nation's most important debates, such as the war in Afghanistan, what that means. And therefore, the conversation is too often dominated by ultra-conservatives who are not our friends and are therefore able to direct our precious tax dollars down rat holes and Kabul rather than address issues of housing and health care and homelessness and joblessness at home. The United States may be going to war against Iran by the end of 2013, and against Syria before that, if it's not already involved in some sort of covert action. Now, where are the analyses from our community, not just from individuals, such as Congresswoman Barbara Lee, but from organizations? Not only that, but it's clear that with wars ongoing and planned wars in numerous nations, the United States at some point will have to bring back the draft. That is to say, young men and women like yourselves, instead of starting careers upon graduation, will have to endure military training so you can dodge bullets for a while. These wars and occupations of predominantly Muslim nations have had a devastating impact on our community, not least because so many in our community are Muslim. And not least since a significant percentage of the Africans who were dragged across the Atlantic during the bad old days of the slave trade were Muslim, while others, of course, converted in the 1960s. Indeed, some of you may be familiar with David Belford, a black American who converted to Islam and about 30 years ago in the earliest stages of the Iranian Revolution, was accused of murdering an opponent of the Tehran regime. And then he fled to Iran, where he still resides and is now being actively sought by the U.S. authorities. After I speak, you may want to check out on Netflix the Iranian movie Kandahar. And you can find him playing a major role in this intriguing film. He's gone to Iran and become a movie star. Or consider another brother from the Washington, D.C. area who joined the jihad, and in fact is the subject of an informative documentary entitled American Jihadists. You can also find that on Netflix. He fought in Afghanistan during a time when the United States and the Taliban shared the same trench against Moscow and against the left-leaning regime. Then he fought in Lebanon, and then in the Balkans, where he continues to reside, as this film shows. Actually, lest I give it the wrong impression, it needs to be said that the rising victimization of Muslims in the black American community is sweeping within its ambit quite a few wholly innocent individuals whose only real crime, sadly, is their religion and their name. They are being harassed at airports, harassed on the job, harassed at school, and of course, that kind of harassment inevitably sweeps within its ambit people who are black who are not Muslim, such as the incident I can describe that happened to me at an airport just a few days ago. They're being harassed not least because of the change in international climate that few of our leaders and intellectuals have sought to analyze in sweeping historical terms. I'm afraid it gets worse. Unemployment is hovering at about 8%. We all know that black unemployment may be double or triple that number. Many of us recall a time when the area around Youngstown, Ohio was a major producer of steel, and the Buckeye State generally was a citadel of manufacturing. But now those jobs are gone, many of which will never return. At the same time, South Korea, which receives billions of dollars in military aid from the United States based on your tax dollars, has become a major producer of steel and auto manufacturing. When was the last time one of our leaders and intellectuals asked why our tax dollars go to support the posting of tens of thousands of U.S. troops in South Korea instead of going to support job creation in Youngstown? Many of us know the story of Detroit, when Henry Ford some decades ago incited a migration of black workers from Alabama in the Deep South to automobile factories about 90 odd years ago. How many of those plants have disappeared? China, which has a population 4 times the size of the United States, now is the major auto market in the world, just as the United States was the major auto market in the 1950s. And those relatively well-paying auto jobs have disappeared and probably will never return. And certainly with the action in Lansing today, that's almost a guarantee that situation will get worse unless we find a way to reverse these legislators' misdeeds. Now, lest you think that only factory jobs are the only ones subject to global forces, which of course is true for auto jobs, steel jobs, etc., please note that any job whose work product can be digitized and transmitted by the internet is subject to sweeping global competition. That includes the jobs of accountants, attorneys, architects, perhaps x-ray technicians, tax preparers, journalists. All of those jobs can migrate abroad, unless, of course, we intervene forcefully to do something about it. And this is already happening. For example, nowadays a computer, rather than a human being, is being enlisted to write many sports stories that appear in our sports pages. Now, this muteness of the black community on international affairs is hurting us domestically. That's another takeaway of my remarks. This term, the U.S. Supreme Court is slated to make yet another decision circumscribing the reach of affirmative action, the most effective and reliable antidote to the kind of racism we face on a daily basis. I'm sure you know about the titanic struggles to maintain affirmative action that have unfolded right here in the state of Michigan. We're told repeatedly and ad nauseum that affirmative action means quotas and quotas are impermissible, and we know this is all false and demagogic. But what is ironic is that quotas are used all the time. Not only when Ivy League schools set aside a number of seats in an entering class for the sons and daughters of alumni. What does that have to do with merit, I ask you? But the international community, including the United States government, uses quotas all the time. You might have noticed the recent selection of the leader of the World Bank, one of the most powerful and important institutions on this small planet. And for the last 70 years, there's been a quota as to who heads the World Bank. This person, according to rules now in place, has to be a U.S. citizen. So it doesn't matter how meritorious or qualified or talented an African or a Brazilian or a Russian or Australian might be, they don't qualify because there's a quota. Yet when we are bashed at home about affirmative action meaning quotas, we do not unsheathe one of our most powerful rhetorical weapons and charge in return our adversaries with hypocrisy, since they all support the idea of quotas when it comes to leading the World Bank. And the same thing is true for the International Monetary Fund, which has to be headed by a Western European, no matter how qualified a U.S. national might be. The same holds true for what may be one of the most important jobs on this planet, which is leading the United Nations. The present leader is an Asian, South Korea's Ban Ki-moon. The leader before that was an African, Ghana's Kofi Annan. When the time to select the next UN leader arrives, discussions will be held, and it would be determined that the next leader must be a Latin American, such as Perez de Cuellar of Peru, who was leader some years ago, or a European, such as Kurt Waldheim of Austria, a leader some years ago. In other words, this is a quota that the United States agrees to internationally, but some of the same people who support it internationally rail against it domestically, and yet our leaders and intellectuals do not either have the gumption or the knowledge to point out this contradiction to beat back the attacks on affirmative action at home. I'm going to fast forward to the end because I know that I've raised a lot of provocative questions that some of you may want to raise some points about. But let me conclude by saying, or trying to put this in a more localized context, that is to say, context relevant to Michigan State. I think that one of the most important tasks to be accomplished in higher education today is for students to become familiar with foreign languages. Already in a de facto sense, Spanish is the second language of the United States. The U.S. is increasingly becoming a bilingual nation. Our nation next door, a stone's throw from where we now sit, Canada is a bilingual nation with French and English. And if there was any message I would communicate to the young people in the audience today, or let me not exclude the older ones too, is to study foreign languages, be it Kiswahili or Arabic or Chinese or French or Spanish. Portuguese, the major language of Brazil, the nation most likely to challenge the United States in this hemisphere in this century. Yet even those students who do not study a foreign language would be well advised to improve their English language skills, which also cannot be stressed enough. Since this language has become, in a sense, a global language, and some of us, in a sense, take our English language skills for granted and don't realize that just like any other skill, this is a skill that one can hone, and this is a skill that we can improve upon, particularly by paying close and careful attention to what we're saying and what others are saying to us. Particularly to the students, I would say that with regard to all classes in the humanities and social sciences, even if your teacher does not insist, you should insist on writing a paper, because written language skills are similarly important to develop. It is a fungible skill that can be used in virtually any aspect of life as you go forward. It means also that in seminar classes, students should be given an ample opportunity to speak extemporaneously off the cuff, because speaking extemporaneously and off the cuff is also a skill that can be improved upon and honed with practice. And you should see your seminar classes as an opportunity to express yourself extemporaneously. If you feel that after a class you escape without speaking, you should not consider that an accomplishment, but a setback. Professors should consider, while it still exists, and students too, taking advantage of the Fulbright program funded by the United States government, which allows teachers to work at universities abroad. In some cases, particularly for African nations, such as Niger, Mali, where French is spoken, sometimes there are no more than 1 or 2 applicants for these positions, which means the competition is not that stiff. And so you should be encouraged to look into that program. Now, brothers and sisters, to conclude, I think it's fair to say that we've been, at least many of us have been asleep for decades as a result of what can fairly be considered a corrupt bargain that led to the attack on Du Bois and Robeson and the granting of civil rights concessions. But here today at Michigan State University, where as I walked into this building I saw placards proclaiming the anniversary of the African National Congress of South Africa, where the African Activist Archive Project has a home. Here today at Michigan State University, where the legacy of Du Bois and Robeson is taken quite seriously, I'm here to announce that we are asleep no longer. Thank you very much.
We have about 30 minutes for Q&A. Okay, David.
Greetings, Dr. Horne. I have 2 brief questions. One of them is, did your law experience bring you to the analysis, what one scholar calls the HORNE thesis? I'm sure you're familiar with that whole line of reasoning. But it basically sounded like a critical race theory analysis of, and I brought that up because Derek Bell and material determinism. So that was one question. The reason I wanted you to come was for the Mama in Harlem. Do you see a break in that? Because in the 1920s through the 1940s, the same thing happened in South Africa. They stopped allowing African